Welcome to the first of two parts of the Birds of Ontario. In this module, we'll be introducing you to 100 species of birds. There are many different species, of course, that are not included on our list. However, for the purposes of this course, we have parceled out a number of species found across many different habitats, so appealing to a wide variety of people throughout Ontario and the different habitats therein. We're confident that we've been able to select a few of these species so that you can get used to the identification procedures. We're going to start off with some generic sort of tools about how we identify birds, picking up from some of the things you've learned earlier in this course, and then we will focus specifically in on the species, the 100 species that we will be testing you on for this course. Like many other animals, birds also have defined range maps. We know that across Ontario and through some of the recommended books that we've done as part of this course, you will see those ranges represented as different colors. So usually a summer range is in the north, where you've got migration from southern, more warmer climates over winter to northern climates where there's seasonal available of food. And then summer, of course, or winter ranges, and then ranges where they can be all year. So range maps are useful because you can eliminate some species when you're looking at them based on the range map. If you know that this is, for example, a bird that only occurs in Western California and you see it in Ontario, then of course you eliminate that because it's not realistic. It doesn't fit the generic range pattern. I'll use the example of the Sandhill crane to illustrate how range maps can be useful. So here we see that there are 5 different colors indicated on the map of North America. So we see the sort of taupe color is rare, where you might rarely find them. The winter ranges are captured in blue, so we can see those are, generally speaking, like most birds, in the southern part of the continent. Summer ranges are significantly north, and we can see they've got a very large and wide expansive breeding range. Migration patterns, so where you would see them during migration, and then where they are found year-round in this case, which is Florida and southern Georgia. So here we see across at a glance where we would see this bird or not at different times of the year depending on the season. So as mentioned previously, this is a great tool we can use to eliminate some species when we're trying to do an identification. So again, birds that don't move around all year, nuthatches, chickadees, woodpeckers, etc., they will be there and you will be able to find them regardless of season. However, there are majority of birds that do leave. So if we're trying to do wildlife observations of a warbler, we would not be doing that in November, December, because they're simply not here. We'd be looking for them in the spring and summer. So understanding a little bit about the bird ecology and the patterns of their migration are really critical when we're trying to identify species. So another tool that we use, of course, in addition to range map, is looking at the pictures of the birds presented in, say, your field guide, etc. One of the things to note about the pictures is, yes, we look at the range map, we can see where they are. We look at the pictures, we look at the features. Generally speaking, they're drawings, so they're an averaged composite of many different individuals. So within a species, there's going to be diversity. Some of the coloration pattern will be different. There will be different sizes, right? The proportions, though, within the tail and the beak, and those should be fairly similar. But the individual variation will be there. So it's important when we're doing our identification, looking at our field guides, looking at pictures, to just be aware that not all members of the species look alike. There will be individual differences, and those differences are important to recognize. Those proportions are really important. We look at the bird relative to itself. So we look to see, for example, how long the bird's bill is relative to its head size. That, for example, is critical when we're looking at something from the Downy or Hairy Woodpecker, two species where their range is highly overlapping. They look very similar in terms of their patterning, but they are different size and different proportions in terms of their bill size. So looking at the Downy one, of course, a very smaller beak relative to the size of the head versus the Hairy Woodpecker. So again, we want to look at other things as well. How long the legs are, how long the neck is, how far the tail extends in the body, how far the primary feathers of the wing are extending from the body. The tail, in terms of the actual pattern, is important, but also the length of it and the way that it's shaped. Those are all other features that we use when identifying a species. And in many cases, especially with our songbirds and other vocal birds, you generally may not even see them, but you can certainly hear them. So by nature of their ecology and their sexual physiology, where they are singing across a multiple, vocalizing across a multiple, in some ways hundreds of meters. Those are the kinds of identification features that we use even though you can't see the animal. So identifying songs and sounds are really important. And so a big portion of the bird module is identifying calls and sounds. So you'll see in the PowerPoint one of the key features is we've provided you a list of the 40 species that we require you to know by sound, and we provided a sound bite for every individual bird, which we'll test you on. Also, Song Hero is another really good tool to help you look at spectrographs and see how those individual variations of songs are captured within and across a species. So this being an introductory course, we're certainly not expecting that you would know the 290 known breeding birds in this province. That's far beyond our scope. However, we've chosen 100 of the more common, the more diverse, and certainly the more easily located species to be identified that you'll be doing as part of your wildlife observations. We've also included of those 140 species that the songs and calls are particularly important for them to be identified. So it will be challenging. But it's certainly something that you'll need to practice. So as part of this presentation, be constantly referring back to these slides as you go over and over them, because identification is not something you can learn and memorize. It's something you have to practice. It's something that you have to do multiple times before you start learning the traits that helps you to identify a species from another one. So for the sake of ease of navigation and for also to sort of orient the studying of these 100 species, we've divided them in half. So this lecture is going to be on the first, or our Part A species, and then the other PowerPoint which we see as Part B are the other species to know. So we've divided them in half just so that, again, breaks it down into slightly more manageable chunks of information. Our first order of species that we're going to study are the Anseriformes. These are waterfowl. They are found very frequently, if not in some cases exclusively, in aquatic environments. Their bills are broad and rounded. They're medium but can be quite large birds. And the males actually have a copulatory organ, which differentiates themselves from most bird species. So these are our swans, our geese, and our ducks. The snow goose is our first of this group, and they're of course a medium-sized goose. They have a hefty bill and a long, thick neck. You can see some of the color patterns here. They are white-bodied goose, and they have very visible black wingtips, which are barely visible on the ground, but extremely noticeable in flight, as you can see from the pictures here. So again, these are some of those key factors here. The pink bill often has a dark line down it, called a grinning patch, or in some cases black lips. You will see different morphs of these species as well. They are, of course, the same. So in terms of habitat, you can see them present there. You can see that they are a large migratory species. They have a very long migration, and they are a very social gregarious bird. So they do occur in multiple units, sometimes hundreds of thousands. The Canada goose, which is a ubiquitous bird across much of Ontario, as we know, it's very easily adapted to agricultural and urban surroundings as well. But this is a very large water bird. It's very long neck, thick web feet, flat bill, has that typical patterning, certainly dark neck and dark head with a white patch in between. Nice tan breast, dark brown wings, and primaries that extend that way. So we'll see these often present. They're one of Canada's most famous export. The Trumpeter Swan is one of our largest birds in Ontario. Large, long, straight neck, black bill and face, as you can see present here. The legs are slightly gray-pink, and they are solid white. We can see these birds many times in urban settings. They're very attractive, and you'll find them in urban parks, etc. The wood duck is by far one of the more attractive and showy ducks, particularly, of course, the male of the species. The female is very much less showy. You can see them both present in the middle image. So these are a very attractive duck both for hunters and also for just for bird watchers as well. They are very unique in terms of the males, have this crested appearance, this green head with lots of black and white patterning, a reddish tan chest or belly, and then the wings, of course, are very unique as well. So the females are less showy. They are brown or gray. They've got a very unique eye patch, though, sort of a Cleopatra eye mask, which is white on their dark or grayish skin. They are found usually in marshes or swamps, and what's unique to this particular species is they nest in holes in cavities in trees. The American black duck is a relatively large duck. It has a profile very similar to the mallard, only of course, as you can see, the coloration is very different. They're a dabbling duck. They like to sit high in the water. They have very dark brown bodies with pale gray-brown heads and yellow-green bills. The females tend to be slightly paler in color with some more dull other bills. Their underwings are bright white, which is one of their features that they can be discovered. Their secondaries are iridescent purple with white borders. You can see those present on the pictures on the top and also on the bottom. So again, similar in profile to a mallard, but notice the color differences between those species. By far likely the most ubiquitous and common duck that you'd see in an urban or rural setting is the mallard duck. So similar in profile to the American black duck, but of course the colorations are very different. The males have those very standard yellow bills with an iridescent green shiny head and neck, white collar, and then of course unique patterning on the wings and secondaries. So the females are much more drab. They are brown or gray. They still do have some iridescent blue speculum patch on the wing, but of course they are certainly more blend and camouflaged into their surroundings than the males are showy. The green-winged teal is another duck. It's a relatively small duck with a crested head, in particular the male. You can see that crest very clearly on the top image here. So the head of the male is brown with a light iridescent green patch with a crest on the back. The females are much more drab in color, so you can see the female present next to the male in the middle image. So some nice speckling patterning. The immature of this species, both males and females, are very similar to the female. They have a yellowish tail stripe on the male, which you can see present there as well. In flight, you can really see the iridescent feathers present on the back of the male. So again, those are all characteristics that we would use to identify the green-winged teal. The ring-necked duck is a relatively compact diving duck. It's got a very unique head shape, a sloping forehead, and peaked rear crown. So you can see the profile of this duck head in the first image there. In flight, they appear relatively large-headed. As you can see, their head size is relatively large in proportion to their body. The males are a bold black and gray duck. They've got a very dark head, black back, and gray sides with a white hash mark on the chest. The females are very rich and brown. You can see them present here on the in the middle image. They have a contrasting pale cheek and a whitish eye ring. Adult males have what they're named for, a prominent, very white ring on the bill. Hence, you can see present in the first image and in the second image clearly on the male of the species. A hooded merganser is sometimes confused with a bufflehead just simply by the fact that there is a white patch on the head, but of course you can look at the profile of this duck and very quickly you'll realize that they don't look anything like the same. They have a very thin bill relative than the other ducks. They have a fan-shaped collapsible crest that makes the head look extremely oversized and very oddly shaped, and you can see that present in both of the image. In flight, the wings are very thin and the tail is relatively rounded. You can see that present in the bottom image. The adult males are black above with a white breast and rich chestnut flanks. The black head, of course, is that characteristic white patch, which varies in size whether the crest is upper and lower. The females are relatively brown and gray with a cinnamon tawny crest color on the head. A common merganser is a very large, long-bodied duck with thin pointed wings. Bills are very straight, and unlike the very wide, flat bill of a typical duck, so similar to the hooded merganser in that way. Females have shaggy crests on the back of their head, which you can see very clearly in the image there. Adult males are very crisp pattern, so they've got very crisp distinction between color and feathering. They have a gleaming white body and very dark iridescent green heads, which you can see in the image. Females and immatures are relatively gray body with a white chest, and you can see that typical rusty cinnamon colored heads. So different than the hooded merganser, you notice very clearly in the male patterning as well. The female is also different, as you can see, but the two species do share some similarities, so in some ways can be confused. The northern bobwhite is a very small range within Canada, or within Canada, certainly in Ontario. It's relatively small quail. It has a nice rounded body and rounded wings and a short tail. Very intricately patterned. So one of the things to look for here is in the male, the characteristic white and black striping on the head, giving way to a very beautifully patterned body. The female lacks the black and white color patterning of the male, instead replaces it with sort of a yellowish orange patterned feathers, so it blends in far more. The females are buffy throated, both above their eyebrow as well, but also very unique pattern and banding, certainly not as prominent, however, as the male. The ringneck pheasant is an import. They're a relatively large chicken-like bird with a long pointed tail and a very plump body. The males are very gaudily showy, so they've used their long tail and their color patterning, but also some of the unique features: a red face with that iridescent sheeny head and a white very prominent neckline to attract the females of the species, which are very less showy for sure. They're brown with paler scaling on the underparts, sort of buffy to cinnamon color. And these species are found in the shrublands in and around Ontario. The ruffed grouse, sometimes inappropriately called a partridge, these are a very large range species of bird. They're a very relatively small grouse. They have a small triangular crest on their head and a long fan-shaped tail. They have short legs and look slimmer than other grouse species. They're very intricately patterned, in particular on the tail and on their underside. So you can see in flight the fan-like tail is quite showy. And you can see the bars present very clearly for this species. Wild turkeys are becoming more and more common as the reintroducing program. It has been very successful for this species. They're very large, plump birds, very long legs and rounded tails. They've got a very typical, what we would identify as a turkey-like pattern with very dark iridescent sheen, with the wattle and other head characteristics that define them as turkey, so featherless on the heads. They have barred tails and certainly wing patterns, which are characteristic of this species, barred with white. The rump and tail feathers are broadly tipped and of course are used for sexual displays by males while courting females. Our next order is the Anseriformes, which is one of our most famous birds, which is the loon, present of course on our loonie. The common loon is found in open water. Many undisturbed lakes or open water lakes will hear the traditional call of the loon, which is likely familiar to some of you. They're large water diving birds. They have rounded heads with dagger-like bills for impaling and catching fish. In flight, they do look stretched out. They're very long and lean. Their feet stick out beyond the tail, unlike other ducks and cormorants, which is one way you can tell them together or tell them apart while they're in flight. In the summer, the adults have a black head and bill with a white and black spotted back and a white breast. From September to March, the adults are relatively plain gray on the back with a white throat. So again, there are some color differences depending on the season, but by and large, we would typically see this bird with their characteristic calling and territoriality in the summer during cottage season. Our next order is the Anseriformes, or the frigate birds. There's only one species that we're going to discuss in this course, and that is the double-breasted cormorant. These birds are ubiquitous around harbors and around, of course, the Greater Toronto area as well as other parts of Ontario. There's a lot of controversy surrounding these birds and the effect that they have on trees and other vegetative species, as they can be quite destructive. They are large water birds. They have very small heads with kinked necks. As you can see here, in all cases, the neck always has a characteristic kink in it. They have thin, strongly hooked bills, which you can see present at the very end. It's difficult to see in these images, but the bill actually does hook at the very end. They have heavy bodies, which sit relatively low in water and skim just on the surface. The adults are relatively brown or black, with a small patch of yellow-orange skin on the face, which you can see present in the images, particularly on the bottom. In the breeding season, the adults developed a small crest of stringy black or white feathers, which again you can see on the images present on the slide. Our next order is the Anseriformes, which is our herons and bitterns, of which there are several species. Of the two in this order that we're going to discuss, one of them is the American bittern, which is found exclusively in our marshes. It's a medium-sized, stocky heron with a thick neck and bill. It's colored with brown, tan, and white stripes, and it blends as you can see when it raises its neck, it blends in almost completely with the cattail marshes and other vegetation which it so loves. The great blue heron, a very stately and well and easily recognizable bird, is the largest of North America's herons. It's got very long legs with a sinuous neck and very thick dagger-like yellow bill. The neck, of course, folds into a very unique S shape during flight, and you can see these large birds as they pump their powerful wings skimming across marshes and over other open water areas. So blue-gray from a distance with a wide stripe over the eye, which you can see with a crest that sticks out from the top of the head. The turkey vulture, one of the very easy birds to identify when flight, with a very typical V-like pattern present in the wings. These birds, of course, are not flapping birds. They coast on thermal, so we'll see them going over large distances, circling, looking for carrion and other scavenged material. Very large birds are very dark color with long, broad wings. They're much bigger than other raptors, generally speaking, and they have fingers in the form of feathers which extend past the toe tips in flight. Their wings make that typical V pattern, and one of the things is up close or through binoculars you can see that they have no feathers present on their heads, which is of course important because their heads are constantly in carrion and decaying carcasses of their food sources. So they have a red, relatively pinkish skin, and then a very light colored bill. An osprey is one of our distinctive hawks. They have very slender bodies with very unique patterning. These very characteristic fish eaters will be found in open areas or marshy areas where the fish are abundant. They're generally brown above and white below, and they're generally speaking much whiter and cleaner looking than most of the other raptors. From below, their wings are mostly white with prominent dark patches at the wrists, which you can see very clearly in the middle image. The head is white with a brown stripe through the eye, which you can see clearly in the bottom image. So again, they have almost a helmeted-like appearance. The northern harrier is a very slender looking raptor. You can see that present very clearly in the second image and down below. They've got a very unique face, almost kind of like an owl-like face you can see in the first image. They have a very long tail, and you can see that clearly in the bottom image. They've got a characteristic white band, which is clearly visible while in flight, which flight patterning, they do fly in a typical V-like pattern, but generally speaking significantly lower and cruising over wetlands and low-lying areas, contrasting to vultures, which will be significantly higher in the sky. So males are generally gray above and whitish below, with very black wingtips and a dark trailing edge to the wing. So you can see that in the second image, those dark wingtips and the trailing edge present on the wing pattern there. A Cooper's hawk is a relatively medium-sized hawk. It's the classic accipiter shape, broad rounded wings and a very long tail. The head often appears quite large on very broad shoulders. The adults are steely gray above with warm reddish colors on the underparts, with very thick bands on the tail. One of the things you can see, contrasting them to one of the more common ones they're confused with the sharp-shinned hawk, is the diffuse streaking that's present there. So here are some images that will contrast them. Notice the banding patterns underneath the wingtips. Notice also the color patterning of the gray on the upper parts of the wings. Our next is the red-tailed hawk, which is a very large hawk in terms of proportion. It's most common seen along roadsides, which is where you're likely to observe them. They're rich brown above, very pale below, with a streaked belly with that characteristic brown patterning. So you can see that present in both of the images. Of course, they're called a red-tailed hawk because, as you can see here on the top image, they've got a very characteristic cinnamon red tail, which is very visible even from a position of perching on, say, a telephone wire that you'd see along a roadside. There are dark morphs as well, rufous morphs of this species, but again, to be aware of it, the characteristic red tail, some of the patterning are key features of identification for this hawk. The rough-legged hawk is relatively large as well, with broad, very long wings. They've got very pale flight feathers with a dark trailing edge, black marks at the wrists, similar to those. One of the things to keep in mind is, of course, the rough-legged is the feather patterning that occurs in and around the legs as well. They're commonly very pale with a streaked chest. They're could be all dark, but they could and will still have pale wing feathers at white at the base of the tail. A red-shouldered hawk, of course, gets its name from its characteristic red shoulders, so that's one of the key features to identify. It's relatively medium-sized. They fan out their tails while in flight, so you can see the barring present there. They have almost a reaching posture, as you can see present. They're very colorful with dark red and white checkered wings and very warm barring on the chest. The tail is black with narrow white bands. And all ages show a very narrow pale crescent near the wingtips in flight. So you can see those present there. But again, the red shoulder coloring patterning on the shoulders is key characteristic for this species. A broadwing hawk is actually a very small, compact raptor with a very chunky body and large head, and you can see those proportions shown very nicely in these images. The tail is very short, and notice also how square it is relative to some of the other exhibitors. The adults have a relatively reddish-brown head. They have barred underparts and a broad black and white bands on the tail. The pale undersides of the wings are bordered in dark brown, which you can see present on the image that's at the top of the slide. The order of Anseriformes, which contains all the rails, gannules, coots, and cranes. In this course, we're only going to be speaking of two species, the American coot and the Sandhill crane. The American coot is a small, sort of plump-looking chicken-like bird, very rounded head and sloping bill, an extremely tiny tail here, as you can see in the image at the top. Very large feet for their wading and for the other bits of their ecology that they're required. They're very dark gray, almost to black, but with a very bright white bill, which is characteristic, and also a very bright white forehead. A sandhill crane is a very large bird, extremely tall, long neck, very long legs. Notice how it carries its head very different than, say, the great blue heron, where it's sometimes confused. The coloration is also different. So these are slate gray birds. They also have a rusty wash on the upper parts, and the adults have a pale cheek, which you can see present especially in the bottom image, and a red skin on the crown. So their legs are also very black, and the juveniles being gray or rusty brown as well. You'll see these often in rural environments, in agricultural communities as they migrate through, and also, of course, are using that for their granivorous grain sources. Their very bulky body leads itself to sometimes clumsy flight patterns. So again, these are some of the characteristics we would use to identify a sandhill crane. And our order Anseriformes, which are plovers, sandpipers, gulls, and terns. There are several species in here, which we've identified as being key for the identification purposes for this course. The killdeer, which is a relatively common bird, especially in disturbed environments and, of course, in other places in Ontario. They have large round heads with a very large eye and that typical short bill, characteristic of plovers. They're slender and lanky. They've got long pointed wings and tails. They've got a very unique vocalization and also very unique behaviors when it comes to their breeding and territoriality. They've got brownish tan on top and white below, White chest is barred with 2 black bands, and they've got a brown face marked with white and black patches. They've got a bright orange buff rump, which is very conspicuous in flight, but very often you'll see them running away as opposed to flying, unless they're very startled. So again, characteristic species of this bird. The American woodcock is a very short-legged, plump shorebird, long, straight bills, very large heads again, short bulbous, sometimes confused with Wilson snipe. Although, if you notice, the coloration and the banding patterns of this bird are very, very different. They're very well camouflaged in light brown, black, and buff colors with gray. The face is very buffy, and the crown is relatively blackish. The ring-billed gull is, of course, one of our most common gulls that we see. It's found everywhere almost where humans can be found. They're medium-sized, fairly short, slim bill. Their color pattern, of course, the adults are clean slate gray above with a white head, body, and tail. The adults are, of course, speckled and have different coloration patterns they go through for the first 2 years. They've got yellow legs, characteristic, and hence their name, a dark ring present on the very almost tip of their bill. They've also got very dark coloring on the tips of their wings. The herring gull, which at first glance looks quite similar to the ring-billed gull, is different in a couple of ways. One is the size. They're significantly larger. They've got a much heftier bill and very robust bodies. Also important to note about the bill is the color. They've got that very typical red dot or red coloration on the underside of the bill, which is not that characteristic black ring which is present on the ring-billed gull. So the adults have light gray backs and black wingtips and white heads similar to the ring-billed gull, but of course the other features being the bill is different in structure and in size and shape. The common tern shares some color similarities with the gulls, but also some differences. So if you see here, the bill coloration is very different. So the bill has a very orange coloration pattern and then tipping to gray at the very end. The head in this case is black capped with a white neck and then gray upper parts. So again, the wings are very white with dark tips and very deeply forked tail. Our next order is the Anseriformes, which are our pigeons and our doves. The mourning dove is a slender dove. Notice the coloration differences between the rock pigeon. So much more slender bird, gray-brown, lighter in color, pinkish below. The wings have some black spotting on them. The tail feathers are white, contrasting with the black inner tail feathers, as you can see present on the image at the top of the page. The eyes are very dark with light pattern around them. The order Stratiformes, including our owls, in particular several species we're going to talk about, barn owls and typical owls. The great horned owl, certainly likely the most famous of our owl species. They are very large, thick-bodied, with feathered tufts on the head, hence their name of great horned. In flight, the rounded head and short bill combine to perform a very blunt-headed silhouette. They're mottled gray and brown, reddish-brown faces, and a very neat patch on the throat. Their overall color tone varies from very sooty to almost pale in color. Barred owls are large owls as well, slightly more stocky than the great horned owl. They have no ear tufts and very rounded heads. They get, of course, their name, barred owls, from the barred patterning that occurs not only on their wings, as you can see stretched on when the wings are extended, but also on their ventral or belly surface, which you can see on the upper side. So they've got those vertical brown bars all the way across. The eastern screech owl, they're a very short, stocky bird with a large head and almost no neck. So you can see present in these two images, they've got a very unique appearance. Its wings are rounded and its tail is very short and square with pointed ear tufts that are often raised with a very distinctive silhouette. They're usually gray or sometimes reddish brown, which is the rufous morph, and they've got very large yellow eyes and spots as well that aid them in camouflage. The northern saw-whet owl, these owls are very small, as you can see here by the relative size to a hand. They've got large rounded heads with no ear tufts. They're mottled black and brown. They've got a facial disc, which is the feather patterning at the front of their face. White spotted head, eyes are very yellow. Our next order, which are kingfishers, are only one species. The belted kingfisher is a stocky, large-headed bird, very shaggy crest on the top of the head with a very thick, pointed bill. They can be found often along lakesides and riversides where they're actively hunting for fish. The males are interesting because even though they're powder blue above with fine white spotting on the underside, the females have a broad rusty band or necklace that occurs across the belly. The juveniles show irregular rusty spotting in the breastband, and males don't have any of that color pattern at all. Our next order, the Pisiformes, which are our woodpeckers. They are unique because they have zygodactyl feet, so they have two toes that go forward and two toes that go backward, and they use those in particular to climb their trees up and down. They also have a unique tendon and arrangement of toes to be able to do that behavior, which is so critical for them to be acquiring their food source, and also, of course, excavating the holes that they need for their nesting cavities, etc. So the yellow-bellied sapsucker is a small woodpecker. It's got a stout, straight bill. It can be easily distinguished by other woodpeckers by the nature of its color patterning. So like other woodpeckers that have banding of black and white with red caps, what's interesting about these woodpeckers is also they have a black neck area but also yellowish patterning below. So that's a characteristic that can be used as well. Both males and females have red patches above their heads and their foreheads, but only the males have red patches below their chin. So those are some other unique features to be used to be able to tell them apart. The downy woodpecker is a very, very small woodpecker with a straight chisel-like bill with a very blocky head. They tend to look very smaller for the bird size than other woodpeckers. So again, we talked about that the bill is very small relative to its side. They have a checkered black and white pattern impression. The males have a small red patch in the back of the head. Notice how much smaller it is compared with the sapsucker. And the females don't have any. So again, those are some features that we use to identify these different species. A hairy woodpecker is a much larger woodpecker than the downy woodpecker. It's a larger size. The bill is larger also in proportion to the size of the head. They are black and white, of course, with black wings checkered as well. There is a large white patch which runs down the center of the back. Males also, similar to the downy, have a little bit of red color towards the back of the head, contrasting with how different it is relative to the sapsucker. The northern flicker is another woodpecker. It's fairly large as well. Very different coloration pattern than the other three. we've seen previously. So it's got a gray, buffy body with a red patch on the back of the neck. Males will have a mustache, which you see is black, covered around the base of the bill. Very interesting checkered patterning or barred patterning down the back, and the wings also have beautiful bright yellow wings and tail feathers. The pileated woodpecker is certainly one of our characteristic species in the woodpecker family, one of our largest for sure. A very long neck and a triangular crest, which differentiates themselves from all the birds that we've seen so far. Bill is very long and chisel-like, about the length of the head, and in flight, the wings are very broad and can almost seem crow-like by the way that the feathers outstretch and are separated. Mostly black and white stripes on the face and neck, and a flaming red crest, and in flight the bird reveals extensive white underwings with small white crescents on the upper side of the primaries. Our next order is the Falconiformes, or the falcons. This is a large group of species, so there's many different species across the globe that are in this order. They have a very interesting evolutionary past. For example, DNA does suggest, and related studies do show, that falcons are actually more related to songbirds and parrots than they are to hawks, eagles, and vultures, which outwardly they look more similar to, and they share similar behavior and biology, but in fact they are more related to songbirds and parrots, hence their own order. The peregrine falcon is our largest falcon over most of the continent. It's very long pointed wings and a very long tail, as you can see here in the image. The adults are bluish gray above with very, very highly barred underparts, as you can see in the bottom image. They've got a very dark head and thick sideburns, almost like they're kind of wearing a helmet, and you can see those interesting bar lines present on the upper image on the slide.